I. Finality and suprafinality, language and expression. At the beginning of the previous article, 4 questions were posed, 2 of which were elucidated in order to answer what is a language and what is the origin of its possible plurality. 2 questions were then left pending. How is the significance of the entity expressed outside, and what is a cultural fact? But before responding to the first, let us once again bring up the terms of the problem. As we saw, the finality of the passu is to give meaning to the world. In order to fulfill such a finality, it is not enough to grant meaning to entities by means of some form of expression. It is also necessary that said meaning endures and is reaffirmed again and again, after a search and perpetual discovery of the design, of a truth that never completely reveals itself to reason. That search, that discovery, that reaffirmation, they please the demiurge. They form part of the object of his pleasure. An external superstructure that sustains the meaning granted to the entities is then required. To construct such a superstructure is a collective task, and languages are the tool with which the passu is endowed to undertake it. In another section, the constitution and development of the superstructures will be studied. But for now, it is enough to know that the form determined by a superstructure is denominated culture. The finality requires, in effect, that the passu collectively be a producer of culture, and in particular, a bidder of meaning. For this purpose, it must make use of a language and languages. The answer to the first question will clarify for us in what manner these requisites are fulfilled. 1. How is the significance of the entity expressed outside? Let us begin with the finality and suprafinality. In entities, as we explained, 2 termini coexist: the intellectual finality and the suprafinality of being for man. The intellectual finality is rationally incognizable because it depends on the universal archetype that sustains the entity and evolves it. But this finality is only the concretion of an entelechy, the fulfillment of a plan. Its development provides no more pleasure to the demiurge than that already obtained at the beginning of creation. To bear the weight of the work, the demiurge requires that certain autonomous entities, or passus, discover the real entities, reflect them in themselves, and give them meaning. The permanent discovery of entities, admiration, awe, or any other affection for the world is the finality of the passu, and the object of pleasure of the demiurge. This is how entities are designated by the demiurge, with a primordial biha that must be discovered by the passu and rationalized in its cultural structure. This biha, this design, this being for man, is the essence of the entity, the knowledge given, the suprafinality. The design is that which is given to rational knowledge, what is taken by reason and interpreted as a schema, and what is signified by the thought of the schema. But in that giving of the design, the entity expects to receive the meaning. That is to say, what is given must be returned, restituted in the entity, but with a new cultural meaning. That meaning, the expression of the significance, is what the passu puts into the entity in place of the design, transforming the entity into a cultural object. The agreement between the finality of the passu and the suprafinality of the entity thus demands a movement in 2 directions, from the entity to the passu and from the passu to the entity. The first transit we have already studied at length. The external entity, given to the sensorial sphere, reveals its design that reason schematizes and structures, and that thought signifies. Of the second movement, which goes from the mental significance of the entity back to the entity, it will now be necessary to expand on in order to comprehend how the passu fulfills its finality. The extremes of the first movement are design and significance. The extremes of the second are significance and expression. With expression, in effect, the passu places meaning on the entities. It returns to them rationalized the design that was given to it. We thus arrive at the nucleus of the question. How is the significance of the entity expressed outside? And we find all its weight falls on the act of expressing. What is to be understood by expressing? Answer: just as the knowledge of the entity, its discovery, begins by the transcendence with which the design crosses the sensorial sphere, so expression is a manifestation of the significance that crosses the sensorial sphere in the contrary direction to the transit of the design. Through expression, the significance of the entity returns to the entity and gives it meaning. But it occurs that everything that comes from the interior of the sensorial sphere and transcends toward the outside necessarily manifests itself as bodily movement. The human body, by its organic nature, supposes a multiplicity of movements effectuated at all times, i.e., continuously, some voluntary, within what can be voluntary in the instinctive will, and others automatic. For example, respiration is comprised of two rhythmic movements, the function of which is to produce the exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide. These phases cross the sensorial sphere in both directions. Also consider the movements resulting from the alimentary and procreative necessity, etc., or by psychoaffective motivations of any type, etc. The totality of exterior movements is called conduct of the passu, the exterior part of the behavior. The problem consists in defining when a bodily movement is expression, but such a definition can only be explained after showing that the movements interior to the sensorial sphere, among which thinking stands out, and the exterior movements occur on continuous, parallel, and correlative planes. But we will show this fact step by step. We previously explained that continuous signification is the horizon of thinking, the immanent vitality of the cultural structure, just as significance is the foundation of thought, the experience of a system. Now, thinking is the faculty that characterizes the passu among other entities, an interior activity. Let us clarify this. The interiority of thinking is understood within the limits of the sensorial sphere. Outside it are the entities of the world, the universal. But within the sensorial sphere, thinking is a continuous activity on the horizon of continuous signification, and outside the sensorial sphere, on the boundary between it and the world, there is a multiple activity resulting from the participation that the passu, as animal man, necessarily exercises with the world. The limit of the sensorial sphere, toward the outside, is a boundary in continuous movement. Actions and reactions unceasingly unfold. The entities press the sensitivity, act inwards, and the brain responds, controlling and integrating the movements of the motricity, reacting outwards, producing a conduct, an exterior behavior. What we want to emphasize here is that the interior continuity of thinking is correlative with the exterior continuity of conduct, with the total movement that the passu continuously displays in the world. We must clarify that this correlativity between thinking and exterior movement does not imply any consciousness. The passu does not yet possess consciousness. Its thinking is strictly rational, developed over the cultural structure. In this thinking, the brain is the fundamental support, but the brain is the center of operations that controls and coordinates all movements, whether or not they are subject to patterns of instinctive conduct. Every movement is reflected in the brain and, by correspondence between structures in the cultural structure, which is vitalized by thinking. There is thus a correlation between thinking and exterior movement. The material body of the passu is a microcosm situated within a macrocosm to which it reflects in its structural organicity. Everything in it moves. It is a phenomenic process as long as life lasts. In this continuous movement of the microcosm, both interior and exterior is correlative. That is to say, the continuous signification, which constitutes the horizon of thinking, is correlative with the exterior movement of the passu, with its conduct. And here comes the key question. Does this correlativity between the interior and the exterior, between the mental and the movements of the material body, enable the continuous signification in which rational thinking consists to be exteriorly manifested in continuous bodily movements? That is to say, is there signification in the movements of the material body with which the passu behaves in the world? The question posed this way, the answer can only be affirmative. Yes, there is signification in the exterior movement of the passu. But such an answer is unsatisfactory if it is not made clear which part of the exterior movement is the expression. First of all, it is necessary to show that here we are dealing with a relationship of general to particular, just as thinking to thought or signification to significance. That is, continuous exterior movement is to expression as continuous signification is to significance. Or, better, expression is a significant movement of continuous exterior movement. The continuous signification, which manifests itself in the world through the continuous external movements, cannot place meaning on the particular entities because it is only a mental horizon, the interior correlate of the continuous existing in the world. Hence, if there is a meaning that the continuous movement places on the world, this exclusively refers to the universal entity. The meaning that the continuous movement places on the universal entity is denominated harmony. And harmony is also defined as a general relationship between the movements of the microcosm and the macrocosm. But suddenly, on the horizon of continuous signification, a relief rises. Thinking apprehends a rational thought. If the significance of this is thought as a concept and, at that moment, there is a correlative exterior movement, then that movement is an expression. Expression is a moment of the exterior movement during which the meaning of the particular entity is put into the world. Before continuing, it is convenient to draw from what we have seen an important conclusion. First of all, it is necessary to emphasize that the mere fact of existing and moving in the world make the passu a bitter of meaning. The being of the passu in the world is the fact of harmony. The macrocosm reflected in its totality by the microcosm makes of the latter a particular entity, and, therefore, the depository of a design. And that design, which makes the passu what it is returned to the macrocosm by the harmonic signification of its being's continuous movement. In second place, let us say that knowledge of this fact is the foundation of ancient wisdom that affirms dance and martial art as modes of bodily harmonic expression. Let us now occupy ourselves with the expression, that moment of conduct, that particular bodily movement that places meaning on the entity. Between the passu and the entity we distinguish a twofold movement, from the entity to the passu and from the passu to the entity. In the first, the entity reveals its design to reason, and reason interprets it as the schema that is signified in thought. A bodily movement, i.e., the transcendence of the entity to the sensorial sphere, produces a mental movement, i.e., that which is signified by thought. In the second, on the contrary, the significance, thought as a concept, ends up in a bodily movement or expression. This second transit raises, from the outset, two questions. One is, what does the expression express? Not the concept, because this is a slice of the relationship, i.e., an aspect of the schema of the entity noted in the meaningful context of a language. The concept never abandons the cultural structure, it can only be thought. The other question produces in us the realization that between the entity and the passu mediates a certain distance. In effect, if the bidding expression of meaning is a bodily movement directed toward an especially distant entity, how is this distance bridged? How is meaning effectively placed on the entity? By what trickery does the significance of the thought bridge the gap and penetrate into the heart of the entity? For these two questions there is a single answer: the projection of the sign. To the question, what does the expression express? It is answered: the projected sign. And to the question, how does the expression place meaning on the entity? It is answered: by the projection of the sign. Of course, this single answer must be conveniently clarified. Let us describe first of all the complete movement. The significance contained in a concept is projected toward the world in the direction of an entity that is found beyond the sensorial sphere. The exterior manifestation of the projection is the expression of a sign. The sign, expressed by a bodily movement, is a signal placed upon the entity of reference. This signal on the entity, which signals the sign, corresponds to what is signified by the demiurgic design of the entity. On the given design, the sign is now placed. The knowledge of the entity is the passing from the demiurgic design to the signified. That is why the projection of the signified, of a sign, on the entity, is the re-knowledge of the entity. Only by being re-known and by being signed, the entity acquires meaning. The demiurgic design is the being for man, the object of knowledge. Only the human sign in the entity, the re-knowledge, places meaning on it, makes it exist for man. The entity begins to exist for man when it is signaled with the sign and acquires meaning. But we must warn that such a meaning can only endure if the sign that confers it is also used by other passus to recognize and affirm the entity. The sign, in effect, must be able to be understood by the community, apprehended and taught, collectively perpetuated in the world. That is to say, the sign placed on the entity must be culturally expressed. This condition of the finality of the passu determines that the sign expresses itself as a term of a language, as the representative of a concept. A community can, thus, agree on certain signs to communicate the knowledge of the entities and to sustain its meaning. Such a set of signs constitutes the expression of a language, not the language in itself, since, as we have seen, all language has its origin in the cultural structure. A structural language is a living organism, and that is why it can grow and develop. Signs are only projections, representations of concepts and symbols, systems of concepts. It should offer no doubt that being a bidder of meaning on the entities is the principal objective of the passu's finality. Culture is a mode of complying with such finality, a systematic and rational mode. That is why languages, which are the fundamental base of the culture, do not fulfill an end in themselves, but instrument and determine the meaning placed on entities. But in fact, one could express a significance and place meaning on an entity without using any language. Of course, in that case the entity would only have meaning for one person, the one who discovered it. It is in order to collectively perpetuate the particular meaning placed on entities that the significance is noted in the context of a language and projected as a conceptual sign, a sign that is converted into a cultural slogan. But this second condition of the finality, cultural perpetuation, should never make us forget that the principal objective of the finality is expression. Without forgetting, then, the instrumental character that rational languages present as sets of conventional signs, which represent concepts and are articulated according to certain methods, laws, or operative rules, let us continue studying the expression of signs. Let us bear in mind, firstly, 3 previous conclusions. 1. Every expression is a bodily movement. 2. Only that movement of which sign represents a concept is an expression. 3. Every sign is the projection of a concept. According to these conclusions, signs can be expressed in very different ways. Let us look at a few examples. Phonetic expression. The signs constitute voices of a language. Phonemes or morphemes, which represent concepts and can be combined with each other to express more complex meanings. The phonetic projection of a concept is, then, the word. However, with the phonetic expression, it is necessary to include other acoustic signs not produced by the human throat, but by any other medium or instrument, and of which tones express a conventional significance. That is why singing, but also music, form part of the significance. That is why singing, but also music, form part of the multiple modes of phonetic expression. Symbolic expression. It is a matter of collectively agreeing on the use of certain entities of signification, i.e., symbols, graphic, or of another type, the function of which is to contain the significance so that it is recognized by all, at all times, thus avoiding that the meaning dissolves in the universal entity as it occurs with the phonetic expression. Ideograms, letters, mathematical or logical symbols, signals, etc., form part of such signs. Visual expression. The signs are visually projected on the entities. In combination with the symbolic expression, it permits the visual recognition of the conventional symbols and their introjection into the cultural structure, where it induces thoughts of corresponding significances. Suggestive expression. By means of appropriate bodily movements, conventional signs that suggest or insinuate a significance are expressed, etc. We have highlighted the most characteristic forms that the Passu uses to express the signs. With this exposition, we have practically answered the question, how is the significance of the entity expressed outside? However, it is convenient to add some commentaries. First, it is proven that for Passu, the verb, the word, the logos, the vox, i.e., the phonetic expression, is perhaps the most important form of expression, but not the only one. Second, the importance of visual expression for the projection of signs and their eventual reading or introjection is emphasized. Third, what is known is the entity, its design. The known is the cultural object, an entity to which has been placed meaning, projecting on it a conceptual meaning, an aspect of truth represented by a sign that is a cultural slogan. Fourth, however profound a concept may be, it will always be a slice of the relationship. Its comprehension will be insufficient to encompass all the notes of the truth or schema of the entity. That is why cultural objects are, invariably, incomplete truths, because they are projections of concepts. Fifth, from here comes the parameter of social or cultural progress that is measured by the capacity that a culture demonstrates to comprehend the truth of the entities. Sixth, the finality of the Passu is fulfilled in two movements, discovering the design and placing meaning on the entities. That is to say, to know and to express. The most important of the two movements is evidently the first, since if an entity is not well known, if the schema or truth of the design is deficient, this will inevitably influence the expression of the significance and the entity, as the cultural object will be, in many aspects, unknown or obscure. But this first movement, as we have seen, depends on the sensitivity, on the archetypal memory or brain, etc., i.e., on the phylogenic specialization of the Passu, on its evolution. On the other hand, the second movement depends on the translative faculty, i.e., on the intelligence put into defining the concept in the meaningful context of a language, and on the quantity of languages in which it is accustomed to express the truth. Cultural progress depends then on the evolution to know and on the intelligence to express. Seventh, Given a cultural object, as greater evolution and intelligence permit, the Passu will progressively place greater meaning on it, will bring it increasingly closer to its truth. Progress is, thus, a direction that assumes the finality of the Passu, to go from the imperfect to the perfect, from the unknown to the known, from the obscure to the clear. This direction toward which the finality of the Passu progresses is called love. Eighth, thus, to comply with the finality imposed by the demiurge to the terrestrial race of the Passus is the common good. In the march toward that good, society culturally progresses, going from the knowledge of the entities to the projection of more and more perfect cultural objects, i.e., it progresses by working with love. Ninth, the Passu's love for the work of the demiurge is its mode of being, its existential guideline. The design of the entity is what is given by the demiurgic suprafinality. The expression of the significance is what is placed by the finality of the Passu, the meaning deposited into the entity. But this placing is an act made with love, a re-knowledge of the entity that does not spurn its future perfection. That is why culture, from the beginning, i.e., from the first expression of a conventional sign, is a fact that points to the good, something well done, an act of love. 10th. Up to here, we have been studying how reason constructs a cultural structure and its functioning. But everything that is constructed in the macrocosm or microcosm can be destroyed. The cultural structure, extremely fragile, does not escape, without a doubt, this principle. It is not convenient, therefore, to give an end to this section without saying a word about the possible destruction of the cultural structure. Let us observe, first of all, that the cultural structure can be destroyed, total or partially, by three main causes: by accident, by its own will, or by induction. Of these causes, only the first, accident, is characteristic of the Passu. Voluntary destruction, or by induction, are cases of which occurrence is subsequent to the spiritual enchainment. The Passu, in effect, represents in the macrocosm a moment of the evolutive cycle of the monad. Its physical manifestation, as a potential microcosm, formally obeys the unfoldment of a Manu archetype, which determines all structures in accordance to the finality. From this fact, one must infer that the Passu evolves according to its destiny, without ever having motive to provoke a voluntary destruction of its cultural structure. It is prone, instead, to accidental destruction, which can occur, for example, because of the ingestion of toxic or narcotic elements. In summary, the Passu is incapable of generating self-destructive or suicidal ideas because they are totally alien to the ends and purposes of human finality, to the destiny that the demiurge planned for man, and that is written in the Manu archetype. As will be seen later, not even the most intense crisis, the deepest abyss, could make the Passu succumb, since the demiurge has foreseen a recovery system based on the active metaphysical participation of sacred symbols. When the crisis threatens to fracture its consciousness, to fissure the thread of its history, the action of certain symbols enables the animic subject, the individual soul, to transfer the control of the microcosm to a collective entity, to a psychoid archetype, avoiding the collapse. On the contrary, the idea of suicide or microcosmic self-destruction as a method to save the crisis or to avoid an unsustainable situation is characteristic of the lost Virya. As variants of such a suicidal motivation and the habitual cause of the destruction of the cultural structure, it is worth mentioning the intoxication produced by the systematic ingestion of alcohol or drugs. Here it is a voluntary destruction, practiced with the nihilistic intention of fleeing from unbearable circumstances. But, contrary to what psychiatry or Freudian psychoanalysis affirms, tendencies and even stress do not constitute symptoms of mental illness, but of purity of blood. Only those who possess an active Hyperborean inheritance are capable of intuiting or comprehending the intrinsic evil of the Judaized society of our times. If he who notices the evil in the world, who clearly feels cornered or directly unable to continue living, opts for a way of escape, it certainly represents an error. But such an error does not invalidate the first positive fact, having found the Judaic world of the demiurge malignant and unbearable, and of having felt himself alien to it. Compared with the absolute value of this Gnostic intuition, the error committed by the lost Virya is minimal, the product of an insufficient purity of blood that impedes him from acting with honor. Hence, the path chosen. Path chosen. Although insufficient, the purity of blood exists, and it represents a value in itself. As will be studied in the second part, the awakened Virya has a luciferic graceful will that allows him to react in a very different way to critical situations, suspending the dramatic tension and revealing the underlying demiurgic deception. He acts, thus, with honor, avoiding falling, like the lost Virya, into temptation. Finally, one must consider the destruction of the cultural structure caused by external induction. To understand this case, it is necessary to take into account that every Virya, whether or not he is aware of it, is permanently involved in a total war. Whatever the position he occupies on the battlefield, in that palastra that is the world of the demiurge, he can never avoid the influence of the strategies in play. On the one hand, the O strategy of loyal siddhas will induce a charismatic message known as the Song of Amor, with the object of impulsing the Virya to procure spiritual liberation. On the other hand, the synarchic strategy of the traitorous siddhas will apply all its pressure to induce the Virya to remain subject to the karmic laws of the Great Deception. It is this last influence that will destroy the cultural structure as soon as indications of a possible strategic reorientation of the Virya are presented. Classic methods, which illustrate the destruction by induction of synarchic origin, constitute the techniques of brainwashing that intelligence services such as the KGB, the CIA, the Shin Bet, etc., or the guided messages camouflaged in worldwide publicity campaigns, the secret objective of which aims at certain target zones of the cultural structure, or the massive and secret distribution of certain drugs that permit hypnotism at a distance, and inhibit or destroy zones of the cultural structure, etc. And among these and other terrible synarchic methods that we could mention, we should not underestimate the arduous destructive task that Freudian psychoanalysts carry out every day in the most advanced countries of the world, those who, together with Marxists, Zionists, Masons, and liberal priests throughout the world, form an army of agents skillfully trained to brainwash and corrupt the honor of the lost Viryas. Now, whatever the cause, accidental, voluntary, or induced, the fact is that the cultural structure can be totally or partially damaged. Total destruction prevents the production of rational representations and conscious representations, an event that converts the Virya into a perfect imbecile. However, the most common is the partial destruction of the cultural structure. Here one must distinguish two cases: that the destruction takes place in the real structure or in the habitual structure. But what does such destruction consist in? Answer: in the rupture of the bonds between nodes, i.e., of the relationships, The principles, of course, cannot be affected in any way. That is why in the first case of partial destruction, what occurs is the semic disintegration of certain relationships of the real structure. This means the disappearance without a trace of some schemata or their impotence to structurally act, even if the cultural subject searches the whole cultural structure in order to experience them. As examples of this, we can mention the concept of homeland, which all Marxists have destroyed because of the brainwashing that the party subjects them to, or the destruction of the concept of wife or spouse, which may have been produced in the cultural structure by a betrayed husband. In these two examples, one of the induced destruction and the other of voluntary destruction, the common thing is that the destruction begins with the concept but can extend throughout the whole schema or relationship. Precisely the psychosocial control techniques of the synarchy employ that principle to cause the selective destruction of certain cultural schemata inconvenient to its ends. The target concept, i.e., the objective toward which the psychosocial strategy points, can be destroyed. If it is achieved, then the following sequence occurs. The destruction of the concept produces the destruction of the schema of the entity. The destruction of the schema of the entity causes the negation of the entity. There are, of course, some intermediate variants, like being the case that the concept is seriously damaged, but without being able to provoke the destruction of the relationship. Then, the schema can be noted in another oblique context, different from the plane of signification of the affected concept. It is the paradoxical case of those who have the concept of a schema in a non-habitual language, scientific for example, but lack the concept of the same schema in other habitual languages, even the common idiomatic language. This contradiction, for example, is observed in those who have been victims of the sacralizing type of the lost viria, i.e., of the dogmatism of priests or fanatics of any kind. They deny or do not know things in one language, but accept or affirm them in another. They deny the lie, but lie. Deny the evolution of the soul, but accept the evolution of animal species. Deny nationalism, but impose national borders. Lack honor, but affirm professional ethics, etc. Whatever the cause, the destruction of the real structure is always systematic. This means that, like a strange cancer, the destruction initiated on a concept can spread to its schema and, by contiguity, association, homology, or any other structural law, encompass considerable parts of the cultural systems. A whole system of associated concepts could be disintegrated as an effect of induced brainwashing or voluntary intoxication. And what this destruction can cause to the higher structure of the psyche, i.e., to the conscious sphere, is something that will only be comprehended after studying the coming subsections. It is only worth adding that, by virtue of the fact that the principles remain unalterable even though the relationships that were uniting them have disappeared, the cultural subject tends to move toward the destroyed systems without being able to experience the corresponding concepts. One experiences, then, a cultural gap of a void of knowledge that was there before, but now seems to have been erased forever. But, just as we have already explained, if the damage of the relationship is not total, it may occur that the schema connotes its significance in the context of another oblique language. The second case, cited above, is that in which partial destruction occurs in the habitual structure. Such structure is comprised of principles and relationships, and the latter consist of schemata of internal entities. The systems of the habitual structure are denominated virtual, because languages are constructed with them. The application and expansion of the habitual structure over the real structure, on a characteristic plane of signification, is the cause of the concept systems linked to each other in a formal or logical way. What effect does the destruction of some systems of the habitual structure produce? Answer. The impossibility of annotating certain schemata in the context of the affected language. Allegorically, we can imagine that it is impossible for us to find meaning in a certain geographical relief due to the mist or fog that surrounds it everywhere. Without having a clear context with which it is integrated but from which it stands out, the relief has no significance. Analogously, the destruction of the systems of habitual structure equates to a contextual vagueness or obscurity that prevents conceptually annotating the experienced schema. However, if the destruction only affects one habitual language, there is always the possibility of annotating the schema in some other language. Brainwashing, nervous breakdown, shock, alcohol, intoxication, drug addiction, etc., for example, may partially or totally inhibit one habitual language, such as mathematical or musical language, and leave the ordinary idiomatic language intact, or vice versa. We said at the beginning that everything constructed in the macro or microcosm can be destroyed, including the cultural structure. But, in some non-irreversible cases, what is destroyed can be reconstructed. Does this principle have validity in the case of the cultural structure? Answer. Such a structure being an essentially energetic construction, the possibility of its reconstruction always exists as long as the destruction has not affected the nervous system or the brain. Let us remember that the cultural structure is erected over the neurological structure of the brain, or archetypal memory, and that all its systems are constructed by the rational subject or reason that functions in it. To reconstruct any schema or system, it is an indispensable condition that the brain be in a perfect state. Notwithstanding the aforementioned possibility of being able to reconstruct the cultural structure, or to construct it with meticulous perfection, the Hyperborean wisdom does not attach any importance to it, because its secret paths of spiritual liberation enable every Virya to access knowledge in a Gnostic way. Hyperborean Gnosis, in effect, offers an unlimited knowledge, which does not require the intervention of reason or the cultural structure because it is obtained outside the psychic structure, in a sphere called air, that one must create with the luciferic graceful will. In the second part, the way in which the lost Virya must act in order to create such superior sphere will be expounded. In summary, what matters to deepen the Hyperborean wisdom and to know the mystery of the spiritual enchainment, a preliminary step of the Hyperborean Gnosis, is the purity of blood, the living presence of the Hyperborean lineage, the primordial memory, the min, the voice of the blood, the symbol of the origin, i.e., a spiritual inheritance that has nothing to do with the cultural structure or the functions of the brain. J. What is a cultural fact? To this question we will briefly respond to because in the second part, the cultural fact will be the object of a detailed study. Let us consider a definition already put forward. Culture is the form that determines a superstructure. But what kind of structure is a superstructure? Answer. The members of every superstructure are cultural objects and men. According to this, superstructures can only be external, since they integrate man into their complexion. Now, we know that a culture is something that is formed in order to fulfill the finality of the passu and, as we saw from the fifth commentary, something that progresses, that develops toward perfection. Progress is rational. It consists in increasing the comprehension of the entities in perfecting cultural objects. From that rational vision of the world, From that placing meaning on the entities emerge the cultural objects that form the cultural context of the Passu. But cultural objects are not simply things deposited in the world. By being named, by receiving a meaning, they have been impulsed to occupy a rational place together with the other cultural objects, i.e., to keep certain significant relationships with them. The area enclosed by a wall, the wall roofed for protection but with windows for watching, the platform under the window that enables watching, eating and sleeping, the chair against the platform, the plate, the spoon, etc. What would the spoon be without the plate without the platform on which it rests, the latter without the light from the window that enables to see the plate, etc.? A cultural fact would not exist at all if the cultural objects were not rationally structured in correspondence with the cultural structure. Thus, on each entity that the Passu is placing meaning, a cultural object emerges, which is integrated into an external superstructure, the overall form of which is called culture. And the external superstructures are systematically increasing as new cultural objects are incorporated. The already existing ones are perfected, or new relationships are established between them. But it should not be naively believed that the superstructures are mere projections of the internal cultural structure of the Passu. On the contrary, the superstructures possess life of their own. They are capable not only of integrating man into their complexion, but of determining his will. Although we will return to this subject in another section, we may now ask what is the mind that, analogously to the cultural subject in the internal cultural structure, animates these external superstructures. Answer: a class of archetypes denominated psychoid or egregore. Naturally, the Passu, by constructing the superstructure, is also feeding the psychoid archetype that sustains it and that is jointly developed. Such feeding is constituted by psychic energy contributed by the whole Passu community, and, due to the interpenetration of its members in the superstructure, the psychoid archetype comes to represent a kind of collective or group soul. In the primitive state in which the Passu communities were finding themselves, in the times of the treason of the traitorous Siddhas, their members were behaving subject to simple superstructures. But such cultures were progressing very little or not at all, until the enchainment of the Hyperborean spirits took place. Finally, a cultural fact is a moment of the culture in which one or several men and the universe of cultural objects are structured in a superstructure, the total meaning of which has a circumstantial character. And, since the direction of the cultural progress is love, and this progress implies the permanent and continuous construction of a superstructure, it is understood that what binds and relates the members of the same culture is love for themselves, for their neighbors, for their cultural objects, customs, etc. And the objects of such love, whatever they may be, will always be susceptible to perfectionment because of the powerful tool that is the bidding expression of meaning. That concludes the section titled Functioning of the Passu's Cultural Structure. I'll continue. Moving on. Functioning of the Passu's sphere of consciousness. The Passu is a microcosm situated within the macrocosm. The demiurge, creator of the Passu, placed a meaning in the microcosm, assigned it a finality, to discover the designs, to express the signs, to produce culture. In order to comply with such finality, the Pasu has an ever-growing cultural structure, the functioning of which we have explained in the previous section. However, the Pasu failed, as a species, in its cultural mission. Here let us examine the principal reason for this failure, so that, at last, the necessity that there was to enchain the Hyperborean spirits is understood. In order to quickly pose the problem, we will note that the cause of cultural stagnation was rooted in the scarce individual development of the Pasu. If we analyze the objectives of the finality, we will verify that, in effect, this rests on the individual capacity of the Pasu as a discoverer of entities. It is of no use that an exterior superstructure exists to sustain the meaning placed on the entities if it is not permanently fed with new meaning, if the entities are discovered and their truth is not expressed in the world. And this task is exclusively particular. It depends only on the individual capacity of each Pasu. It is for this reason that the fulfillment of the finality demands, parallelly, the individual evolution of the Pasu, the acquisition of an ever-increasing individual capacity to discover the entities. To avoid any kind of doubt, we must distinguish two objectives in the finality, enchained or structured to each other, the macrocosmic objective and the microcosmic objective. The macrocosmic objective of the finality is the one already declared, to discover the designs proposed by the suprafinality and to express by means of signs the discovered truth, placing meaning on the entities that constitute culture. This objective procures that the greatest possible good is produced in the macrocosm. For it, the Pasus construct with love superstructures of cultural objects or cultures that produce pleasure to the demiurge. The pleasure of the creator who verifies that his work is permanently discovered and valued or recognized and revalued. In the previous subsections, we have already sufficiently clarified the scope and purposes of the macrocosmic object of the finality. In the present section, we will study the microcosmic objective of the finality, the purpose of which aims to enhance the individual capacity of the Pasu as a discoverer of entities. A. The microcosmic objective of the finality. To fulfill the macrocosmic objective, to construct cultures in permanent evolution, a joint evolution of the microcosm is necessary, an increase in the individual capacity to discover the entities. The thesis that we expose here is that, concluded in phylogeny, the evolution of the Pasu was continuing in the development of a microcosmic historical subject, which is denominated conscious subject or consciousness. Such a subject animates the sphere of consciousness, which, as will be seen, is also a structure. The evolution of this subject is that which failed and prevented the Pasu humanity from fulfilling the microcosmic objective of the finality. It should be clear that consciousness is a historical subject, and in order to demonstrate it, we will resort to analogy. We already saw how, by placing meaning on the entities, the Pasus are constructing external superstructures. The form, determined by such superstructures, is denominated culture. With the passing of time, superstructures grow or are modified and cause the variation of cultures. It is because of the superlative influence of time that history is considered as the most important dimension of a culture. But when does history of a culture begin? Answer: at the moment in which the members of such culture realize that a past cultural fact possesses more meaning than any other that no one could remember. This answer deserves 4 commentaries. First, the past event, which gives beginning to history, is that which has the most cultural meaning, and therefore its memory is the most intense and not the oldest. Memories may exist of previous events, but history begins at that event, the happening of which is determinant of the future of the culture. The birth of a legendary hero, his feats, a battle, the merging of two nations, the coming of a god or of his envoys, the writing of a code, etc. Second, a past cultural fact, the meaning of which is greater than the others, is a historical fact. Third, even if two or more historical facts are not causally related, they are historically related by being united by a subjective line through which the members of a culture go back to the past. Fourth, history is, then, a temporal line of signification. Let us now draw a parallel between the superstructure and the cultural structure. First of all, both are being constructed. They are growing as time goes by. But the history of a superstructure, or culture, begins when its members notice that they already have a history, that there were past events that were more important than the others, and even that there was that event, the importance of which cannot be surpassed by any other. What is equivalent to that event, the origin of history, in the cultural structure of the microcosm or passu? Answer: the discovery of itself, entity among entities. That is to say, the passu fulfills its finality of discovering the entities since birth. No one teaches him how to do it because reasoning is a hereditary faculty. Thus, it goes about constructing the cultural structure almost without noticing it, design by design, schema by schema, relationship by relationship, concept by concept. One day, however, it discovers an entity. One day, however, it discovers an entity situated among the entities of the world, the design of which shocks him, i.e., it proposes itself as an object of knowledge and discovers itself, and that discovery is that of the greatest possible significance. The cultural structure, of course, was already existing before this event, but nothing can be equated with it and nothing can be the same after it. The discovery of itself is the fact that marks the birth of the conscious sphere, analogous to that historical fact that was marking the history of The discovery of itself is the fact that marks the birth of the conscious sphere, analogous to that historical fact that was marking the origin of the history of a culture. Both are facts of the greatest signification, and their event comes to produce a realization of one's own identity. In one case, individual, in the other, collective or cultural. The conscious sphere is initiated, then, at a moment of the existence of the cultural structure. It begins from the discovery of itself and temporally extends as the seat of the historical subject of the microcosm. The creation of the conscious sphere must be interpreted in a way analogous to the construction of the cultural structure by the rational subject or reason. A posteriori to the bond between principles and relationships, the cultural structure is animated by thinking, i.e., by a cultural subject. In the same way, a posteriori to the conscious sphere appears the conscious subject that animates it. Naturally, such subjects are only aspects of a single animic subject or soul of the passu, as will be shown in Article E, the act of which we generally denominate thinking. We have seen that the microcosmic objective of the finality procures to enhance the individual capacity of the passu as a discoverer of entities. This capacity is effectively increased from the moment the discoverer of entities discovers itself, knows itself to be an individual different from other entities, i.e., acquires self-consciousness. But the consciousness of the passu is not yet the ego. This only appears after the enchainment of the spirits, as will be seen later on. We already know when consciousness is initiated, but what interests us most is to know what modification introduces its presence in rational thinking, i.e., what dimension or characteristic of thinking unequivocally demonstrates to us that we are dealing with consciousness and not with any other psychic act. Answer: the temporal intention of thought. We will make this answer clear by means of a structural explanation. In the previous section, we studied how a cultural structure is constructed and with which elements, principles, and relationships. The relationships are semic schemata of entities that are characterized by three dimensions: extension, comprehension, and potency. The definition of this last dimension, the potency, had been left pending for the present section. Now we will see that the potency of a relationship keeps a proportion, a ratio, with the intensity that the intuition of itself has impressed the sensitivity of the rational subject. Let us begin by reviewing the steps of rational knowledge. When a given entity impressions the sensitivity, reason refers and applies it against the archetypal memory. With the first operation, it eliminates the universal archetype and discovers the demiurgic design or suprafinality. With the second operation, it configures a schema of the entity based on the archetypes of the archetypal memory. The application of the design against the archetypal memory implies a direction of the instinctive will of the passu, i.e., an intention. Such intentional contact with the archetypes produces their actualization on the plane of realization of the psyche, in a substratum of the affective and rational spheres. The archetypes are actualized in the psyche as principles every time the first operation eliminates a universal archetype, and only one time each. And also as relationships, to configure the schema of the entity every time the second operation requires it. This actualization of the archetypes manifests itself as permanent semic representations or elements of the cultural structure. The principles are simple symbols. The relationships are complex symbols. But the simple symbols of the principles, which are unique as principles, can be repeated countless times in the substructures of the relationships. The difference between them, we said in B of the previous section, is in the potency. The principles are passive potencies, and the relationships active potencies. There is no way to voluntarily influence the operative sequence of reason. As long as knowledge is rational, the first operation will eliminate the universal archetype of the entity and will automatically actualize the inverted archetype in the cultural structure. The intentional intensity put into play to produce the actualization of a principle is, thus, minimal, and it is because of such lack that the potency of it is passive. But the relationships, on the contrary, are constructed with the actualizations of archetypes intentionally located by the second operation, the potency being active and proportional to the intentional intensity with which the discovery was made. Here we will especially occupy ourselves with the active potencies that underlie the relationships. On what depends the intentional intensity with which the rational operation of schematizing an entity is carried out? Answer: on the self-reference with which said entity is taken by reason. Naturally, if we are speaking of self-reference, we are admitting a prior self-knowledge, i.e. the existence of a consciousness. In such a hypothesis, it turns out that not all entities are equal for itself. Not all are known with the same intentional intensity. A stone is not the same as a fruit. The intentional intensity put into schematizing the stone is different from that used with the fruit. In the passu, for itself, the fruit is more important than the stone. That is why the schemata or relationships of both entities are differently referred with respect to itself. And these different references are manifested in the potency difference of the relationships. The potency dimension of each relationship is self-referent in a particular manner. But thinking a relationship is rational thought. What determination introduces in the thought the self-reference of the potency? Answer: a temporal intention. It is the same answer as above, which will become more comprehensible in the light of structural analysis. The thought of a relationship can acquire, by the self-reference of its potency dimension, a determinate temporal intention, and that makes it conscious, as we explained above. The schema of an entity, even if it remains integrated in the cultural structure, is potentially self-referent to the microcosm. The thought of a relationship occasions the actualization of that direction into potency that is the self-reference, being thus the thought directed in turn, impulsed by a temporal intentionality. Directed toward where? Answer. Just as potency refers to the relationship to self, conscious thought, temporally intentioned is directed to the conscious sphere, or preconscious in the primitive passu, figure 11. This response should be understood as follows. The self-reference of reason does not point to a center of individuality, because nothing like that exists in the passu. The psychic structure or plane of realization where the archetypes are actualized is the natural seat of the ego, and toward those misty spheres the reference of reason is oriented, being plasmated into the potency of the relationship according to the intensity with which the archetypes were actualized. The potential self-reference is what unfolds in the thought of the relationship and renders it conscious, impulsing it beyond the psychic substratum where the cultural substructure exists, toward the conscious sphere. But this actualization that the potential reference produces in thought is not of archetypes but of symbols. It is the symbols of the schema that unfold in thought and become conscious because they are self-referent, self-directed. A schema of which potency is very great self-refers the thought with such force that it shoots toward the conscious sphere as conscious thought or consciousness of a relationship. And those conscious thoughts, more actual than others, delineate the thread of union of consciousness, analogously to how historical facts, cultural facts with more meaning than others, delineate the thread of the history of a culture. Such a subjective line demonstrates that the consciousness is the historical subject of the microcosm. According to what has been expounded in this article, the consciousness is a historical subject that registers a moment of appearance from which all the relationships that are formed will be, to a lesser or greater extent, potentially self-referent, i.e., to the microcosm, considered or intuited as an individual entity. The thoughts of relationships, or systems, are determined by such potential references and impulsed toward the conscious sphere, i.e., toward the higher layers of the affective and rational spheres in order to emerge beyond them. The conscious sphere would thus come to be the superior stage of thinking, creating it is... The conscious sphere would thus come to be the superior stage of thinking. Creating, it is the microcosmic object of the finality. As we already said, this conscious sphere was not sufficiently developed in the passu and led to its cultural stagnation. On what does the development of the conscious sphere depend? On a faculty of thinking that arises from the active potencies of the relationships and directs thoughts toward it, taking it as the intentional temporal center of reference. In the following article, this faculty will be studied. I'm going to stop there. When we continue, we will continue with B, the translative faculty, a function of active potency. Thank you once again for joining me. Stay tuned.